stripping Meghan and Andrew of their titles was the right course.
Prince Andrew did not arrive at Windsor expecting warmth, but he expected recognition. He expected the old rules to hold. A car door opened, a palace aide stepped forward, and within seconds, the humiliation was no longer private. His name was missing from the Windsor guest list. Not misplaced, not delayed, removed. And in that single moment, the palace made a message painfully clear. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Andrew stood at the entrance of Windsor Castle, and for a brief, terrible second, he seemed unable to understand what had just been said. Windsor Castle, the royal residence long used for family gatherings, state moments, and private royal business, was not just a building to him. It was memory. It was rank. It was proof that he still belonged somewhere inside the royal circle. That was why the moment mattered. Being turned away there was not like missing a dinner. It was a public wound placed on private pride. The aide lowered his voice and repeated the same words. His name was not on the official guest list, the controlled record used by palace staff to decide who could enter a royal event. Andrew stared at him, then looked beyond him toward the doors, as if the walls themselves might overrule the paper. They did not. The silence around him grew sharper. A driver waited. A guard refused to meet his eyes. And Andrew, once used to doors opening before he reached them, found himself standing outside a world that had suddenly learned how to close. Charles sat inside Windsor when the message reached him. The king did not rise. He did not ask for Andrew to be brought in through another entrance. He remained still, one hand resting near the edge of a polished table, because he already knew what the decision would cost. Charles understood that removing his brother's name was not just administration. It was a line drawn between blood and duty, between old loyalty and the survival of the crown. The king felt the pain of it, but he let the order stand. The removal had not happened by accident. A sealed amendment, meaning a private written change to the event instructions, had been sent to household staff the night before. Andrew was never meant to be gently warned at home. He was meant to discover it at the threshold. One senior courtier watched the entrance and understood the cruelty of the timing. The palace wanted the boundary seen. The humiliation was part of the message. Andrew's face changed slowly from disbelief into controlled anger. He asked who had authorized it, but no one answered quickly enough to satisfy him. That hesitation told him everything. Somewhere inside Windsor, 3 people already knew why his name had vanished. Charles knew, William knew, and someone else had helped make sure the door stayed closed. Because the guest list was never just a list, it was a battlefield where family loyalty, royal survival, and old resentment were about to collide. Behind the walls of Windsor, the humiliation outside the door carried a different meaning for everyone inside. For Andrew, it was exile dressed as protocol. For Charles, it was a wound he had chosen to make. For William, it was necessary. And for Camilla, watching the room shift around her, it was proof that the monarchy had entered a colder age. Charles felt the message land before the aide finished speaking. The king stood at the center of the decision, not as a brother trying to avoid pain, but as the sovereign, the person who carries the highest duty to protect the crown and its public trust. That mattered because Andrew's presence was no longer just a family issue. Every entrance, every handshake, every seat at a royal gathering carried meaning. If Andrew walked in as if nothing had changed, the palace risked telling the world that memory mattered more than accountability. William had already reached a harder conclusion. The prince believed that every soft exception given to Andrew weakened the future he would one day inherit. The future king was not thinking only about one reception. He was thinking about the monarchy's next chapter, the fragile trust around it, and the danger of letting old habits dress themselves up as mercy. William had warned days earlier that allowing Andrew inside Windsor would send the wrong signal after a previous private breach, and now the warning had become action. Andrew remained outside, and his anger began to sharpen. He did not shout at first. He lowered his voice, which made the demand more dangerous. He wanted Charles, not an aide, not a message, not another careful sentence from someone holding a folder. Andrew wanted his brother to face him directly and explain why the doors of Windsor had closed. But no one moved to fetch the king. No one even pretended to try. That stillness told Andrew the decision had already passed beyond sympathy. Charles placed one hand flat on the table when the demand reached him. The monarch did not look surprised. because he had expected Andrew to read the removal as betrayal. Still, expectation did not make it easier. Charles knew his brother would remember childhood rooms, shared corridors, old privileges, and all the ways royal blood had once protected them from ordinary consequence. The king also knew those protections had become dangerous. Camilla watched him carefully. The queen consort saw Charles avoid William's eyes, and in that small movement she understood what had changed. The king had accepted his son's harder line. William did not celebrate it, but he did not retreat either. The prince stood firm, and Camilla sensed the room bending toward the future. But the true reason for Andrew's exclusion did not begin at the Windsor gate. It began days earlier, in a room where one sentence changed everything. To understand why Andrew was stopped so publicly, the story has to move backward to the hidden moment that turned family discomfort into royal action. Every royal crisis has a moment people later pretend they did not see. This one happened at a private dinner, when the silver was still on the table, and the smiles had not yet disappeared. Andrew lifted his glass, spoke too freely, and turned a controlled family gathering into a silent warning. After that night, Windsor stopped wondering whether he could be managed. Andrew smiled before the damage began. He sat at the Sandringham Restoration Dinner, a private family event held to mark the repair of old royal rooms and the renewal of family tradition, and he seemed determined to remind everyone that he had not vanished from the story. The dinner mattered because it was meant to show unity. It was supposed to prove that the family could still gather behind closed doors without old wounds taking over the table. Instead, Andrew turned that peace into pressure. Charles watched his brother lift a glass, and the king knew at once that something reckless was coming. Andrew made an arrogant toast about still being born close enough to the crown to matter, and the words struck the room like a dropped blade. The crown, meaning the symbol of royal authority and the family's public duty, was not just a phrase in that room. It was the very thing Charles had spent years trying to protect. Andrew had wrapped his pride in royal language, and everyone understood the warning hidden beneath it. William's face hardened as Andrew spoke. The prince did not interrupt. He did not need to. He set down his glass so firmly that the conversation around him died. William understood why the toast mattered. Andrew was not only asking to be remembered, he was reminding the room that he believed his closeness to power still gave him leverage. The future king heard the threat inside the joke, and his silence became colder than any rebuke. Camilla looked from Andrew to Charles, and she saw embarrassment pass across the king's face before he could hide it. Charles did not want to correct his brother in front of the room, but everyone was watching to see whether he would. That hesitation hurt him. It made him look torn. It made him look trapped between family weakness and royal duty. Camilla saw that conflict clearly, and the queen consort understood that Andrew had forced the king into a corner. Andrew then made the deeper mistake. He hinted that certain private family decisions could become public if he was treated as disposable. No one laughed. No one lifted another glass. A senior courtier later drafted a confidential warning, a restricted palace note meant for only a few senior eyes, stating that Andrew's presence at future gatherings posed reputational and internal risk. That warning traveled from Sandringham to Windsor, and by the time Andrew arrived at the castle, the door had already been closed in writing. But paper decisions are one thing. Watching a royal brother confront the consequences face to face would become something far more brutal. The most dangerous royal confrontations are rarely loud at first. They begin with clipped voices, careful titles, and a door that refuses to open. Andrew stood near the Windsor entrance, surrounded by people trained never to react, and demanded the one thing nobody was prepared to give him: direct access to Charles. The humiliation had become a challenge. Andrew refused to leave, and that refusal changed the air around him. He wanted the guest list removal explained by the king himself, not by household staff holding polite faces and careful words. The guest list, the official record deciding who could enter a royal event, had become a weapon in that moment. That mattered because Andrew understood what everyone else understood. A missing name at Windsor was not a small mistake. It was a public sign that his place inside the family had been cut down. Palace aides tried to guide him toward a private side corridor, but Andrew would not move. He remained near the entrance, forcing the standoff to stay visible. The aides knew why this mattered. If they pulled him aside too quickly, it would look like panic. If they left him there too long, it would become a scene. Andrew sensed their fear and pressed harder. His voice dropped as he asked whether Charles had forgotten who stood beside him before the crown became heavy. Charles heard those words minutes later, and the king closed his eyes before answering. The crown, meaning the monarch's power and public duty, had become heavier than any family memory Andrew could throw at him. Charles knew that if he came down, the decision would turn into a negotiation. His brother would demand mercy, the staff would witness hesitation, and Windsor would learn that a closed door could still be forced open by anger. So the monarch told the aide he would not come. William entered the corridor instead. The prince walked into the tension without Charles beside him, and Andrew saw the truth before a word was spoken. This was not only the king's decision. The future king had shaped it. William's face carried no triumph, only cold resolve, and that made the moment worse. Andrew wanted a brother to blame. Instead, he found the next reign standing in front of him. Andrew stepped closer and demanded to know when family had become something to manage. William held his ground. The prince did not raise his voice. He said, "This is not about punishment. This is about protection." The words landed with brutal calm. Andrew looked past him toward the closed door, then back at the man blocking his way, and the humiliation hardened into something darker. Andrew understood then that Charles had not acted alone, and the insult was no longer just personal. It was political inside the family itself. The confrontation exposed the truth Windsor had been trying to hide. Power had shifted, and Andrew had just met the person holding it. William did not raise his voice because he did not need to. Inside Windsor, power no longer sounded like anger. It sounded like restraint. The prince had learned that monarchy survives not through sentiment, but through boundaries. And for Andrew, the most devastating part was not being stopped by palace staff. It was realizing the future king had decided he was no longer worth the risk. William walked away from the corridor with no victory in his face. The prince had pushed for a stricter internal attendance policy after the Sandringham dinner. And an internal attendance policy simply meant palace rules deciding who could attend private royal events and under what approval. That mattered because family gatherings were no longer private in the old sense. Every seat carried a message. Every invitation could become a headline. Every exception could look like weakness dressed as kindness. Charles had accepted the recommendation because hesitation had become dangerous. The king knew the monarchy could survive sadness, but it could not survive looking confused. Andrew's presence at Windsor would have told the public that nothing serious had changed after the private warning at Sandringham. William understood that risk with brutal clarity. He believed the future of the crown depended on discipline, and this time Charles allowed the future king's colder judgment to stand. William stepped into a smaller room after facing Andrew and finally let the tension show. The prince placed both hands on the back of a chair, breathing slowly, as if the words he had just spoken still weighed on him. He felt no triumph. He had wounded a family member, and he knew it. But he also knew the deeper cost of doing nothing. The monarchy had spent years paying for silence, delay, and soft treatment. William would not let that become his inheritance. Camilla watched Charles after the confrontation, and she saw grief settle over him. The queen consort did not interrupt, as the king sat without speaking, his gaze fixed on nothing. Charles was not only thinking about Andrew outside the door, he was thinking about childhood, loyalty, and the terrible fact that kings sometimes have to injure the people they once protected. Camilla understood the pain, but she also understood the shift. William had drawn the line, and Charles had not crossed it. The final authority came through a restricted household note, a private palace instruction shared only with selected staff. It removed Andrew from the Windsor guest protocol for the event, and placed future attendance under direct approval. That note mattered because it turned one painful moment into a system. Andrew had not been blocked by emotion. He had been blocked by policy. Then came the detail that made the room colder. A second name had been quietly added to the review list, suggesting Andrew's exclusion was not an isolated punishment, but part of a wider palace reset. William knew it. Charles knew it. And Camilla, watching them both, realized Windsor had entered a new age. By nightfall, the locked door at Windsor had become more than family discipline. It had become the first tremor of a public royal earthquake. Andrew's departure was quieter than his arrival, and that made it worse. No dramatic exit, no public shouting. Just a car turning away from Windsor, while the castle remained lit behind him. For a man who once moved through royal spaces, as if they belonged to him, the message was unbearable. He had not simply been excluded. He had been shown the edge of the family circle. Andrew did not speak when the aide guided him away from the entrance. The reception, a private royal gathering where invited family members and selected guests came together under palace control, continued without him inside. That mattered because his absence was no longer hidden. Staff had seen it. Security had seen it. And the old promise of royal protection had failed him in the place where he once expected it most. Andrew had not been asked to wait. He had been refused. The household moved quickly into containment mode. Staff were told to avoid discussion, keep the evening steady, and act as if the interruption had never happened. Containment mode meant the palace's quiet effort to limit damage before it spread beyond the walls. That mattered because the family understood how fast one scene could become a national judgment. A missing name could become a headline. A closed door could become a verdict. Andrew's humiliation had to be managed before it consumed the night. Andrew sat in the back of the car without speaking at first. He removed his gloves slowly, one finger at a time, as if control could be rebuilt through the smallest gesture. But his face betrayed him. The anger had cooled into something more bruised. He had expected resistance, perhaps distance, perhaps a cold welcome. He had not expected the finality of being turned away before he could even cross the threshold. Then he made one call from the car and spoke only a few words. They have chosen their side. Charles remained inside, but the news of Andrew's departure reached him like a physical blow. The king pushed his chair back and walked to the window without addressing the room. He had chosen the crown, but the crown did not comfort him. It only demanded more. Charles knew Andrew would carry this moment as proof of betrayal, and that knowledge cut deeper than any public criticism. The monarch had protected the institution, but the brother inside him had paid for it. A palace aide later discovered a chilling detail. The guest list amendment, the written change removing Andrew's access from the event record, had been circulated to fewer than 5 people. That meant any leak could only come from a very small circle. William knew the risk. Charles knew the risk. And somewhere inside Windsor, someone understood that secrecy had become almost impossible. Yet the real turning point would not happen in public, or through staff, or through documents. It would happen when Charles and William finally faced each other alone. Because once Andrew was gone, the question inside Windsor changed. Not whether the decision was right, but what it had cost the father and son who made it. After the guests had moved on and the palace had regained its practiced calm, Charles and William found themselves alone. No courtiers, no advisors, no careful language prepared by staff. Just a father who had lost another piece of his family, and a son who believed the crown could not survive old loyalties forever. This was the true turning point. Charles asked William to remain after the reception, and the request carried more weight than any command. The reception, a private royal event where invited guests gather under palace control, had ended in form but not in feeling. That mattered because Andrew's removal had not faded with the evening. It had followed the king back into the quiet. It had followed the prince too. The doors had closed, the staff had withdrawn, and the decision now sat between father and son, like something neither could fully put away. William stood near the table and waited. The prince knew this was no longer about a guest list, or a single refusal, or one angry man leaving Windsor in silence. This was about the future shape of the monarchy, the living system of roles, duties, and public trust that held the royal family together. Charles understood that system as a burden. William understood it as a test, and between those two views stood Andrew, wounded, furious, and already outside the circle. Charles spoke first, and his voice carried the tired honesty of a man who had run out of easy choices. The king admitted that seeing Andrew turned away felt like watching another door close on the family he once knew. He did not defend his brother's behavior. He did not deny the risk. But Charles allowed the pain to show. Andrew had been difficult, proud, and dangerous to protect, yet he was still his brother. That truth made the decision necessary and cruel at the same time. William answered carefully. The future king did not attack Andrew. He did not soften the facts either. He said compassion could not become permission, because the monarchy had already paid too high a price for hesitation. The prince meant every delayed boundary, every private warning ignored, every public wound made worse by silence. William knew mercy looked noble until it became weakness. Then it became damage. Charles revealed, through a private conversation with his son rather than any palace statement, that he had considered warning Andrew before the event. The king chose not to. because he feared his brother would pressure him, argue with him, and force the decision into another emotional bargain. William listened, then made the defining statement. Andrew's future access would remain restricted unless Charles personally accepted responsibility for changing it. Charles did not argue. His silence became consent. William understood it. The king understood it too. By morning, the world would know that Windsor's private rupture had become public fact. The next day, the palace could no longer control the story, because the humiliation at Windsor had escaped into the streets, the studios, and the front pages. By sunrise, Windsor's silence was gone. The world did not see the private anguish, the closed rooms, or Charles standing at the window. It saw one brutal image, a royal arrival that ended at the door. The monarchy had tried to contain Andrew's exclusion as a family matter. Instead, the public turned it into a verdict. Andrew watched the coverage from a private sitting room, and every repeated phrase seemed to tighten his face. The palace had issued a brief response, describing attendance arrangements as private, but that careful line only made the story burn hotter. Attendance arrangements meant the palace rules deciding who could enter a royal event and who could not. That mattered because the statement did not deny the humiliation. It did not say Andrew had chosen to leave. It did not say his name had been included. Its silence became confirmation. Charles saw the first newspaper spread shortly after. The king looked physically drained as the page was placed before him, because he understood the awful trade he had made. The decision had protected the monarchy, but it had exposed the family wound to the whole country. Charles had wanted control. Instead, the world now had a single, sharp image to hold on to. Andrew at Windsor stopped before the door, while the royal evening continued without him. Andrew's jaw tightened as commentators repeated the phrase, "left off the guest list." He had heard criticism before. He had endured distance before. But this was different. This sounded final. Broadcasters framed the story as a historic sign that his position within the royal family had reached a new low. One presenter described it as the clearest palace boundary in years, and Andrew heard those words like a sentence being read aloud. The public moment that captured everything came from a London newspaper front page. It showed Windsor Castle at dusk with the headline, "The door closes on Andrew." The image spread fast because it needed no explanation. Windsor stood for belonging. The closed door stood for rejection. And Andrew's missing name became the symbol of a family finally willing to turn discomfort into action. Outside Windsor, a small crowd gathered near the gates. Some people stood in silence. Others debated whether the palace had acted too late or finally acted firmly. That gathering mattered because it proved the story had moved beyond royal gossip. People were not only asking what happened to Andrew, they were asking what kind of monarchy Charles and William were building. Charles felt that question settle over him. Andrew felt the answer closing around him. William did not need to speak publicly, because the decision had already spoken for him. Beyond the headlines, the meaning of the moment was settled inside the monarchy. Andrew had crossed from controversial relative to controlled risk. And when the noise of the public reaction finally faded, one conclusion remained sharper than every headline. Windsor had changed its rules, and Andrew was the proof. Prince Andrew's humiliation at Windsor was not merely about one missing name. It was about the end of an old protection. For years, blood had softened consequences. Doors had opened because titles still mattered. But on this day, the monarchy chose survival over sentiment, discipline over discomfort, and the future over the past. The verdict was cold, clear, and final. Andrew had walked toward Windsor expecting resistance, perhaps distance, perhaps a cooler welcome than he once knew. He had not expected absence. The guest list removal, the decision to take his name off the official record, used to control entry to a royal event, became more than a palace action. It became a symbol of a monarchy no longer willing to hide difficult family choices behind ceremony and silence. That mattered, because the old system had often protected pain instead of facing it. This time, the door did not bend. Charles remained emotionally torn, but the king's choice showed where the crown now stood. The crown, meaning the monarch's public duty and authority, demanded control even when family loyalty begged for softness. Charles knew Andrew would feel betrayed. He knew his brother would remember old rooms, old rules, and the years when royal blood still carried automatic protection. But the monarch also knew that every exception had a cost. Andrew's pain was real, yet the monarchy's survival had become the heavier duty. William emerged from the crisis as the harder guardian of the next era. The prince was not driven by cruelty. He was driven by memory, consequence, and the belief that public trust could no longer be gambled away for private comfort. William understood that mercy without boundaries can become weakness. He understood that a future king cannot inherit every old mistake and call it loyalty. For him, Andrew's exclusion was not revenge. It was a warning to the whole family. The future would not be managed by guilt. Andrew was left with the most painful realization of all. The institution he once believed would always make room for him had learned how to close the door. His title still existed, his history still existed, but the privilege around him had changed. Windsor had not erased him from the family story. It had removed him from the protected center of it. That was the deeper revelation. The removal had not been an accident, a misunderstanding, or a temporary embarrassment. It was a boundary drawn with intention. Charles's silence after the decision became its own confirmation. The king did not reverse it. He did not soften it. He did not privately undo it once the headline struck. He allowed the humiliation to stand, and that silence spoke louder than any announcement. It told Andrew that the old bargain was finished. It told William that the future had been acknowledged. And it told the monarchy that survival would now require harder choices than sympathy alone could carry. This moment meant Andrew's old place inside the royal fold was gone. Not erased from history, but removed from privilege. Windsor had delivered its judgment without shouting. The family could mourn him, but the monarchy would no longer shield him. There is no unresolved mystery left at the castle gate. Andrew arrived expecting entry, found his name missing, and left carrying the message Windsor intended him to feel. The monarchy had moved on without him. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.